He was waiting for his divorce papers when she called. In 8 months, she convinced him he was a new man. What he didn't know was that she was the one doing the remaking. By the time he understood what was happening, she'd already taken everything. His money, his pride, his ability to trust his own judgment. This is the story of how someone loved him back to life so perfectly that he couldn't see she was dismantling him while he thanked her for it. It's April 1953 in Newark, New Jersey. Robert Castellano is 42 years old, and everything he built is collapsing. 20 years of marriage ended in a divorce that cost him more than money. It cost him his standing in his community, his relationship with his teenage children, and his sense of himself as a man who understood the world. His wife left him for a younger man, and the scandal rippled through the insurance company, where Robert had worked for 18 years. People who'd called him friend suddenly had less time for calls. He lives now in a 1-bedroom apartment above Moretti's Pharmacy on Broad Street. The radiator clanks at 3 in the morning. The walls are thin enough that he can hear his neighbors' arguments. He spends his evenings at home drinking bourbon that tastes expensive enough to feel like self-respect, and watching the rain streak the window. His lawyer calls every few days with updates about the settlement. It's not getting better. Every new conversation costs him money and dignity in equal measure. Robert is handsome in the way that middle-aged men can be. His hair is still dark, his features are sharp, and he dresses carefully because appearance is the only thing he still controls. But there's something in his eyes now that strangers notice. Defeat has a look. It's the look of a man who believed in a version of himself that turned out to be false. He's waiting for the divorce papers to be finalized so he can claim this strange new identity. A single man, a free man, a man who might someday be something again. He doesn't know yet that freedom is just the space where someone else's design can take hold. The call comes on a Thursday evening in late April. He's sitting in his apartment with the radio playing softly. Sinatra, which feels appropriate for grief. The phone rings. Robert doesn't answer unknown calls anymore. He's learned that unexpected contact usually means trouble, but something makes him pick up the receiver this time. Some intuition that tells him this call is different. Robert? Hi, I'm not sure if you remember me. This is Margaret Ashford. I'm friends with Catherine Rossi. We met at that dinner party last year. She mentioned you'd recently moved to the area and gave me your number. I hope that's all right. Her voice is careful, warm, but not intrusive. She's giving him an out. She's being respectful. Already, Robert feels something shift, the sensation of being treated like a person who deserves consideration. Of course, he says, and he means it. Catherine's mentioned you. How are you? I'm well. Thank you for asking. I know this is a bit forward, but I'm new to New Jersey and I don't know many people yet. I was wondering if you might want to have coffee sometime. No pressure at all. But Catherine spoke so highly of you, and I think we might have interesting things to talk about. Robert is quiet for 3 seconds. This is the moment where his life splits into 2 versions. In one version, he says something polite but final. He's not ready. He's still married in his heart. In another version, he says yes. He says yes. I'd like that very much. He tells her, this is the moment, not the moment of deception, that hasn't begun yet. The moment before deception, when someone who is genuinely lost meets someone who has learned exactly how to look like solid ground. Margaret suggests a coffee shop near her apartment in East Orange. She's efficient and kind about it. She asks about his schedule, suggests a time that works for him, and tells him she looks forward to it. When he hangs up, Robert realizes he's smiling. It's a small thing, but it's real. For the first time in months, he feels like someone wants his company. He doesn't know that Margaret spent 40 minutes researching Newark society pages and newspaper archives before calling him. He doesn't know that she specifically chose Catherine Rossi as the entry point because Catherine had mentioned Robert's recent separation to a woman who knew Eleanor Reeves. He doesn't know that Eleanor Reeves, because that's the woman's real name, had already identified him as a target 3 weeks ago. He doesn't know that this phone call was not chance. It was architecture. What Robert feels instead is hope. And hope, when you've been without it long enough, is indistinguishable from love. To understand what Eleanor does to Robert, you have to understand what Robert has already done to himself. You have to understand the shape of the hole that Eleanor will fit into perfectly. Robert Castellano was born in 1911, the second son of Italian immigrants who owned a bakery in the ironbound neighborhood of Newark. His father was a man of rigid conviction. Money was earned through work. Respect was given to authority, and family was the only institution that mattered. His mother was quieter, the kind of woman who expressed love through endless labor. She cooked, cleaned, managed the household, and asked for nothing except that her children do well. Robert inherited his mother's intelligence and his father's discipline. He was a good student, careful and deliberate. While his older brother Vittorio went into the family business, Robert was the one who would escape, through education, through profile, through becoming someone his parents' generation had not provided a template for. He went to Rutgers on a partial scholarship, studied accounting and business, and returned to Newark with ambition that felt almost shameful in its personal nature. He wasn't returning to the bakery. He was returning to build something for himself. By 1933, he was working in insurance. By 1940, he was managing a regional office. By 1945, he was married to Catherine, a woman from a respectable family, and living in a house in the suburbs. He had 2 children, a son named Michael and a daughter named Anna. From the outside, it was the achievement of every post-immigrant dream: respectability, stability, the kind of life that suggested you'd made it. But inside, Robert was always aware of the performance. He was aware that he'd constructed a life that worked, not a life that felt true. Catherine was a good wife, dutiful, competent, attractive, but there was no passion. There was no moment where Robert felt seen by her. They operated in parallel, 2 people managing a household and raising children, but rarely touching in the way that suggests genuine connection. And then in 1952, Catherine met someone else. His name was Frank, and he was a younger man with money and charm and the kind of ease that Robert had never developed. Catherine didn't plan to leave. It wasn't a calculated decision. She simply realized that some part of her, a part that had been asleep for 20 years, could wake up again with Frank. She asked for a divorce. Robert, devastated and furious, agreed. He had some dignity left, and it meant not fighting her. But what Robert didn't understand was that Catherine's leaving wasn't about him specifically. It was about the fact that he'd never really been available to her. He'd been performing being a husband. He'd been managing a role. And Catherine, after 20 years, simply couldn't do it anymore. The divorce process was brutal. Catherine's family had more money than Robert's. They could afford better lawyers. There were accusations and counter-accusations. Catherine claimed Robert was cold and emotionally unavailable. Robert claimed Catherine was shallow and unfaithful. Both things were true. Neither thing was the real problem. The real problem was that Robert had never learned how to be genuinely intimate with another person. He'd learned how to be successful. He'd learned how to be respectable. But he'd never learned how to let someone see him, and let that seeing change him. By April 1953, when Eleanor calls, Robert is a man who has been hollowed out by the discovery that the life he built so carefully was hollow all along. He's facing the fact that his marriage was a performance, that his career, while genuine, never filled the space where a real self should be, that he's approaching middle age and has no idea who he actually is. He's lonely, but more than that, he's open. He's vulnerable to someone who can suggest that all of this, the failure, the shame, the collapse of everything he thought he'd built, might be exactly what he needed to finally become real. This is the man Eleanor is calling. His sister Lucia knows something is wrong. She calls him the week before he meets Margaret, and Robert is short with her. He's tired of being pitied. He's tired of being the cautionary tale whispered about at family dinners. He tells Lucia that he's fine, that he's moving forward, and that he doesn't need her concern. Lucia doesn't believe him, but she also doesn't push. She's learned that Robert has always needed to arrive at his own understanding. He's never been a man who can be warned. He has to discover things himself, and by then the damage is usually complete. They meet on a Saturday afternoon at Ferraro's Coffee House, a small Italian place with red and white checked tablecloths and the smell of espresso that tastes like home to Robert. Margaret is already there when he arrives, sitting at a corner table with a book. She's reading Sartre. She looks up when she sees him, and her face organizes itself into a smile that suggests genuine pleasure at his arrival. She's beautiful in an understated way. Her dark hair is pinned carefully. Her dress is simple but expensive. She's wearing reading glasses on a chain, and when she takes them off, her eyes are intelligent and kind. Robert makes a mental note that she's not young. She must be in her mid-30s, and something about that matters to him. He's tired of feeling like he has to compete with youth. This woman is accomplished and present, and there's a maturity to her that suggests she's chosen to be here, not that she's settling for a moment. "Robert, thank you for coming," she says, extending her hand. Her handshake is firm. She's not performing femininity. She's performing competence. They order coffee. Margaret orders an espresso and a small pastry. Robert orders coffee and a biscotti. They talk about Catherine Rossi for a moment. Safe, neutral territory. Then Margaret asks him a question that no one has asked him in months. "Tell me about your work," she says. "Catherine mentioned you're in insurance, but she didn't say what that actually means. What draws someone to that field?" Most people, when they ask about Robert's work, are performing interest. They're looking for a gap in conversation to fill. But Margaret is actually listening. She's asking follow-up questions. She's interested in the architecture of insurance, the way it's built on prediction and risk management. She's interested in how he got into the field. She's interested in whether he enjoys it. And Robert, for the first time in years, finds himself talking authentically about his work. He talks about the satisfaction of understanding risk. He talks about the way insurance is really about people, about understanding what terrifies them and helping them protect themselves from terror. He talks about the intellectual puzzle of it. He finds himself saying things he didn't know he thought. Margaret listens with her whole attention. She doesn't check the clock. She doesn't shift the conversation toward herself. She asks intelligent questions that suggest she's actually following. And when Robert finishes, she says something that lands deeply. "That must require a real understanding of people," she says. "You have to see past what they say they're afraid of, to what they're actually afraid of. That's a kind of intimacy in its own way." Robert has never thought of his work as intimacy, but as soon as she says it, he understands that it is. And he understands that Eleanor has just paid him a compliment that works on multiple levels. She's admiring him for his work, but she's also suggesting that he possesses exactly the quality he fears he lacks, the ability to understand other people. They talk for 3 hours. Time disappears. Margaret tells him about her work as a translator. She speaks French, German, and Italian fluently. She tells him about growing up in upstate New York. She tells him about moving to New Jersey because she wanted a fresh start, and she doesn't elaborate on why she needed one. There's something strategic about what she reveals. She tells him enough to seem real, but not enough to be verifiable. She tells him things that make her sympathetic. She's also starting over. She also knows what it's like to want to begin again, but she doesn't overshare. She maintains a kind of mystery. She's present, but not entirely present. When Robert leaves that afternoon, he feels something he hasn't felt in years. The possibility that someone might actually like him. Not the performance of him. Him. The actual person sitting across the table. He doesn't know that Margaret has been trained in this. He doesn't know that Eleanor Reeves has done this exact dance before. He doesn't know that everything she said was calibrated to make him feel seen, while keeping her own inner architecture completely hidden. Over the next 3 weeks, they see each other regularly. Coffee becomes dinner. Dinner becomes walks through Branch Brook Park. They develop a rhythm. Margaret is always attentive but never demanding. She's always available but never clingy. She's interested in his thoughts, but she doesn't try to change him. Slowly, Robert begins to tell her things. He tells her about the divorce. He tells her about Catherine and the way his marriage had been empty. He tells her about his children and the distance that's grown between them since the divorce. He tells her about feeling like a failure at the core of himself. And Margaret listens without judgment. She doesn't tell him he's not a failure. She doesn't minimize his pain. Instead, she does something more powerful. She suggests that what happened to him is actually the beginning of something real. "You know," she says one evening as they're walking along the canal, "I think some people have to break before they can actually live. I think you were performing a life that wasn't yours. And yes, it broke, but maybe that was necessary. Maybe now you get to build something real." Robert stops walking. He looks at this woman who he's known for 3 weeks, and he feels something shift inside him. Someone is suggesting that the worst thing that's happened to him might actually be the beginning of the best thing. "Do you really believe that?" he asks. "I do," Margaret says. "I think you're actually in the process of becoming someone real, and I think you're going to be remarkable." Robert doesn't know that Eleanor has already identified his exact psychological architecture. He doesn't know that she spent hours with Catherine Rossi, gathering information about what would make Robert feel most seen and most valued. He doesn't know that every word Margaret speaks to him is designed to rebuild him in a specific direction, toward her and toward accessibility. What Robert knows is that for the first time in years, someone is suggesting that he's worth something. Someone is suggesting that he's capable of growth. Someone is suggesting that his pain might have meaning. Margaret is, in other words, becoming indispensable to his sense of himself as a viable human being. By June, Margaret has repositioned Robert's entire life, not through anything dramatic, through small suggestions delivered with genuine affection. "You know," she says one evening, "that suit is well made, but it's what a man wears when he's trying to disappear. Have you ever thought about dressing in a way that actually commands attention?" They go shopping together. She helps him pick out clothing that's more distinctive, shirts in deeper colors, a suit that actually fits him with confidence rather than concealment. "There," she says, adjusting his tie in the mirror. "That's the version of you that I see. Your manager at work," she says casually over dinner, "seems to have very conventional ideas about risk assessment. Have you ever thought about pitching him some of your more innovative approaches? I think your mind is sharper than his, and I think he might be holding you back." "That Vittorio," she says when Robert mentions his brother's criticism of his divorce, "seems very invested in the idea that you should be ashamed. I wonder if that says more about his own limitations than anything about your worth." Each of these suggestions is delivered without pressure. She's not telling Robert what to do. She's simply reflecting back to him a version of himself that she sees, a version that's more powerful, more interesting, more authentic than the version he believed was real. And Robert, hungry for this reflection, begins to reshape himself around it. He buys the new clothes, he starts speaking more confidently at work. He draws up a new risk assessment model that his manager actually implements. Within 2 months, he's promoted to a senior position and given a salary increase of $150 per month. It feels like validation not just of his work but of his entire being. Margaret celebrates this success with genuine enthusiasm. "I knew you could do this," she tells him. "You just needed to believe in yourself the way I believe in you." Robert is beginning to understand something, or rather Eleanor is teaching him to understand something, that will reshape how he moves through the world. He's learning that believing in yourself and having someone else believe in you are two completely different things. He's learning that the former is fragile and inconsistent, but the latter feels solid and real. He's learning, in other words, that he's dependent on her belief in him to maintain his own sense of viability. By July, Margaret has moved from the periphery of his life to the center. She's at his apartment multiple times a week. She's organized his closet. She's reorganized his kitchen and his books. She's introduced him to restaurants and art galleries. She's transformed his existence from the gray, isolated life of a divorced man into something that feels like living. She's also becoming strategic about his other relationships. "Your sister Lucia seems very invested in making sure you fail," she mentions one evening. "Do you notice how every time something good happens, she finds a way to diminish it? I don't think that's sisterly concern. I think that's control." Robert pushes back mildly. "Lucia is family. Family is important." "Of course family is important," Margaret agrees, "but so is your well-being. And I'm not sure Lucia can understand what we're building together. Some people are threatened by transformation because it means they have to question their own choices." Robert doesn't realize that this is a calculated isolation strategy. He doesn't realize that Eleanor is teaching him to see his sister's legitimate concern as jealousy. He experiences it as Margaret protecting their space, not as her gradually severing him from the people who might recognize the pattern. The same thing happens with his colleague James, who invites Robert out for drinks. Margaret mentions afterward that she noticed James seemed to be encouraging Robert to talk about his past, in a way that felt like gossip. "I wonder if he's actually interested in your well-being or if he's more interested in having interesting stories to tell other people." The same thing happens with his children. When his son Michael calls to arrange a visit, Margaret suggests that Robert might want to cancel. "You're in a fragile place of rebuilding," she says gently. "Seeing Michael right now when you're so vulnerable might pull you back into old patterns of shame and self-abandonment. Maybe wait until you're more solid." Robert, who desperately wants to see his son, agrees to postpone. He tells himself it's temporary. It's strategic. Once he's more stable, he'll reconnect with Michael. Once Margaret understands that his relationships with his children are important, she'll support them. He doesn't understand that isolation is the goal, and every postponed visit is a brick in the wall that Eleanor is building between him and everyone who might see clearly what's happening. But the most sophisticated aspect of what Eleanor does to Robert is not the isolation. It's the identity reconstruction. Eleanor understands something about human psychology that most people never learn. We believe what we do far more strongly than we believe what we think. If she can get Robert to behave like a successful, confident man, he'll eventually believe he is one. And if he believes he's a successful, confident man, he'll be vulnerable to her in exactly the right way. He'll be grateful to her for revealing this true version of himself. She's also beginning to subtly introduce the idea that they have a future together. "I've been thinking," she says one evening, "about buying a small building, something I could rent out and generate passive income. I know it's forward, but I could see someone like you being valuable to a project like that. Have you ever thought about investing in real estate?" Robert has thought about it in the abstract, but he hasn't had capital to invest. But he does now, thanks to his promotion. And more importantly, Margaret is suggesting that their futures might be intertwined. By August, Robert is already imagining a life with her. He's imagining a business partnership. He's imagining marriage. He's imagining that the worst thing that happened to him, the divorce, was actually the clearing away of false identity, so that his real self and his real life could finally emerge. What he doesn't understand is that the real self Margaret is reflecting back to him is a fabrication. It's a character she's designed specifically for him. It's built on his vulnerabilities and his needs and his hungers, but it's no more real than the performance he was giving as a married man. Margaret is not revealing who Robert actually is. She's building a new version of him that serves her interests. And Robert, grateful for the first time in his life to feel genuinely seen, is offering no resistance whatsoever. Eleanor is, in fact, not even lying to him yet. She's telling him the truth about what's possible, and using that truth to place him exactly where she needs him to be. By September, Robert has forgotten what his life was like before Margaret. He doesn't remember the darkness of April. He doesn't remember the isolation of those first months after the divorce. He remembers it intellectually, but emotionally, it's as if those months belonged to someone else. Margaret has begun to merge her life completely with his. She's spending 5 nights a week at his apartment. She's begun referring to it as our place. She's subtly reorganizing it in ways that suggest permanence, hanging her clothes in the closet, keeping her books on the shelves, establishing a routine that assumes continuation. And Robert is ready. He's actually more than ready. He's been primed by months of feeling genuinely seen and understood. He's been trained by the experience of transformation to believe that Margaret is the source of his ability to be real. So when Margaret mentions in late September that she wants to talk about their future, Robert assumes she's going to suggest marriage. Instead, she suggests something more subtle and more devastating. She suggests that they should become business partners. "I've found a building," she tells him. They're sitting in her new apartment, which is larger and more impressive than his, and which she's framed as a temporary thing while she looks for her actual investment property. "It's in East Orange, near where I am now. It's a good neighborhood, good bones. The owner is motivated to sell quickly, and I could get it for a fair price." Robert nods. This is the property she mentioned months ago. "The thing is," Margaret continues, "I don't have quite enough capital for the down payment and the renovation costs. But if you were willing to invest, let's say $15,000, I could make this work. And then once the building generates income, we could expand. We could build something real together." Robert feels a small hesitation. $15,000 is a significant amount of money. It's more than a year of his previous salary, but it's also less than his new annual income. And more importantly, Margaret is suggesting that they could build something together, that their connection could expand beyond romantic territory into something productive and shared. "How would the investment work?" he asks carefully. Margaret explains it clearly. She'd be the property manager and the developer. He'd be an investor. They'd split profits 50-50 after renovation and operational costs. It's actually a very reasonable structure. It's the kind of thing that a smart woman would propose. It's the kind of thing that a genuinely collaborative couple would do. "I want you to think about it," Margaret says, and she pulls back. A crucial move. She doesn't push. "I wouldn't ask you if I didn't think it was a real opportunity. But I also know this is a big decision. Take your time." Robert takes 2 days. By the end of those 2 days, he's convinced himself that this is actually the logical next step. Margaret has given him a path to authenticity and transformation. Investing in her project is a way of validating that transformation. It's a way of saying, "I believe in what we're building." He meets with a lawyer, his own lawyer, not someone Margaret knows, and has the investment structure reviewed. It's legitimate. It's actually quite reasonable. The lawyer suggests being careful but doesn't advise him to decline. Robert commits to the investment. What he doesn't know is that the building has already been identified by Eleanor. What he doesn't know is that there is no down payment shortage. Margaret is simply extracting capital. What he doesn't know is that his name will not actually appear on any ownership documents. What he doesn't know is that the building will eventually fail to generate the income promised, and by then it will be too late to extract his investment. But something more important is happening than financial extraction. Something more important is happening than the slow dismantling of Robert's independence. What's happening is that Eleanor is teaching Robert to see her as essential to his well-being. Every success he's achieved since April, he's learned to attribute to her. Every aspect of himself that feels real, he's learned to connect to her belief in him. And now, by asking him to invest in her project, she's extracting a kind of emotional commitment that goes far deeper than money. She's teaching him that supporting her is the same as supporting himself. One evening in late October, as they're walking along the banks of the Passaic River, Margaret asks Robert something that seems casual, but will become the central architecture of their relationship. "If you had to choose," she says, "between my well-being and your own, what would you choose?" Robert laughs. He thinks it's a philosophical question. He thinks there's a clever answer that suggests you can have both. "I don't think I'd have to choose," he says. "If you're happy, I'm happy." Margaret stops walking. She takes his hands and looks at him directly. "That's exactly what I needed to hear," she says, and she kisses him. It's the first time she's shown what looks like genuine vulnerability to him. It's the first time she's admitted to needing anything from him, and it lands perfectly. Robert experiences this moment as proof that their relationship is real. He doesn't understand that it's actually evidence of expertise. Eleanor is no longer performing the role of someone who understands Robert. She's beginning the work of making Robert understand that understanding her is his purpose. By November, Robert has given Margaret access to his bank accounts. This was her suggestion, framed as streamlining their financial life together. It seems reasonable. It seems like the kind of thing that couples do when they're planning a future. What Robert doesn't understand is that this is the moment where he transitions from partner to resource. He also doesn't understand something else. Eleanor has truly become Margaret to herself. She's been Margaret for so long now, and she's been so effective at it that she's no longer sure exactly what the distinction is between the character she created and the person she actually is. This is the trap that deception builds. It doesn't just trap the victim, it traps the deceiver. And by the time Eleanor recognizes that Margaret is becoming more real than Eleanor ever was, it's too late. She's already committed to a lie that requires constant validation. That validation can only come from Robert. As long as he believes in Margaret, Eleanor can believe in her too. By December, Robert has ceased to exist as an independent entity. He's still breathing. He's still going to work. He's still performing the external functions of being a man. But the person he was before Margaret, the careful, analytical, somewhat rigid man who understood insurance and kept his emotions contained, has been systematically dismantled and replaced with a version of himself that exists primarily in relation to her. This is not something he's aware of. This is what makes it so devastating. He notices small things, but he rationalizes them. He notices that he's withdrawn $8,000 more from his savings than he'd planned. At Margaret's gentle suggestion that the renovation is progressing faster than anticipated, and they need to accelerate the timeline. He notices that she suggested he postpone his annual vacation with the company because, "We need you to be available right now." He notices that his clothes are being organized in a way that reflects her preferences rather than his own. But each of these things comes with a narrative that makes it reasonable. The renovation is progressing well. The vacation can be taken next year. His clothes look better in her chosen arrangement. And more importantly, each of these accommodations comes with a small reward, a word of approval from Margaret, or a moment of her focused attention, or the satisfaction of having supported her in something that matters to her. Robert is learning a lesson that every person who's been systematically manipulated learns. It's easier to rationalize compromise than to acknowledge control. There's a moment in December that Robert will remember for the rest of his life, even though at the time it seems small. He comes home from work on a Thursday evening and Margaret is upset. She's been upset all day, she tells him. She's heard rumors about the building deal. Someone, she doesn't know who, has been making inquiries about the property. She thinks someone is trying to sabotage their investment. "Did you tell anyone about this?" she asks. There's hurt in her voice. "Did you tell your brother? Or your sister?" Robert assures her he hasn't. He's kept it completely confidential as she requested months ago. "I know you wouldn't do it intentionally," Margaret says, and she puts her head on his shoulder. "But sometimes people find out things. And I'm worried, Robert. I'm worried that someone is trying to keep us from being happy." Robert comforts her. He holds her. He promises that no one will sabotage what they're building. And in the process, He makes a decision. He's going to pull even further away from his family, not as punishment for them, but as protection for Margaret. That weekend, when his sister Lucia calls to invite him to Christmas dinner, he declines. When she asks why, he finds himself saying things he's heard Margaret say. I need to focus on what's real. I need to be with people who understand me. Lucia is quiet on the other end of the line. Robert, she finally says, I know you've been hurt, but… He cuts her off. I have to go, he says, and he hangs up. Margaret is watching him as he puts down the phone. She doesn't say anything, but he can see in her expression a quiet satisfaction. He's just severed one more connection. He's just made himself that much more dependent on her. The financial extraction accelerates through January and February. Margaret has decided to expand the building project. She needs another $10,000 for additional renovations. Then there's a tax situation that requires $3,000. Then there's a structural issue discovered during inspection that requires $5,000. Robert begins to understand that his savings are disappearing. He's given approximately $31,000 to this project in less than 4 months. That's nearly 60% of his accessible capital. But when he tries to raise concerns, Margaret responds with something between hurt and disappointment. I thought you believed in this, she says. I thought you believed in me. And Robert, having spent 8 months learning to equate her belief in him with his own ability to function, finds himself unable to maintain his concern. He recommits. He agrees to the additional investment. What he doesn't know is that there is no building. There has never been a building. Margaret collected the down payment from a legitimate real estate listing, but she never purchased it. Instead, the money has gone into accounts that Eleanor controls. The building is a fiction, and it's a fiction that Robert's own desperate need to believe in it has made real. By March, something else is happening. Robert is beginning to notice small inconsistencies in Margaret's story. He catches her in a lie, a small one. She tells him she had coffee with an old friend named Diana, but when he asks about Diana later, she seems confused about who he's talking about. She corrects herself quickly. She meant another friend, Susan. But for a moment, Robert sees something. For a moment, the mask slips. He doesn't mention it to her. Instead, he finds himself rationalizing it. Everyone misremembers names. Everyone makes small mistakes. It's nothing. It's not a sign that anything is wrong. But it plants a seed of doubt. And doubt, once planted, grows in ways that are hard to control. He begins to pay attention in ways he hasn't before. He notices that Margaret's background story has certain gaps. When he asks about her parents, she's vague. When he asks about her childhood friends, she deflects. When he tries to look at her passport, a casual request meaning nothing, she becomes uncomfortable and suggests that trust doesn't require documentation. Robert tells himself that everyone has privacy. Everyone has things they don't want to discuss. It's a violation to push. It's needy and suspicious. But at night he lies awake and wonders. He wonders who Margaret actually is. He wonders if any of the last 8 months is real. He wonders if the man he's become, this dependent, isolated, financially drained version of himself, is a person he actually wants to be. And then Margaret notices something is different. She notices his attention has shifted, and she does something sophisticated. She doesn't fight it. Instead, she allows him to discover something that will pull him back into the trap completely. She accidentally leaves a journal on the nightstand. It's filled with handwritten entries about Robert. It's filled with genuine emotion, fears about whether he actually loves her, hopes about their future, moments of vulnerability. The entries are dated months ago, back to when they first met. They suggest that Margaret has been emotionally invested in this relationship from the beginning. Robert reads the journal and feels something break inside him. But it breaks toward her, not away from her. She was vulnerable too. She was scared too. She was hoping for the same connection he was hoping for. The doubt he'd been feeling dissolves. The inconsistencies seem small. The financial extraction seems like a shared project between two people building a life. What Robert doesn't understand is that the journal is not Margaret's actual journal. It's a fiction Eleanor created, knowing exactly what would resonate with him, knowing exactly what would pull him back from the edge of clarity. It's almost impossible to describe the psychological precision required to do this. Eleanor has to understand Robert deeply enough to know what journal entries would be most convincing. She has to write in a way that sounds authentic, but contains enough emotion to seem real. She has to place it where he'll find it, but not so obviously that it seems staged. She has to do all of this while maintaining absolute certainty that he won't confront her about it. By April, exactly 1 year after the initial phone call, Robert is completely isolated from everyone who knows him. He's given approximately $40,000 to a project that doesn't exist. He's become financially dependent on Margaret because he's spent down most of his liquid capital, and most importantly, he's become emotionally convinced that his ability to be real, his ability to survive even, is dependent on her continued belief in him. In other words, Eleanor has successfully rebuilt him into a container that holds her needs rather than his own. She's taken a man who was already hollow and given him a new kind of hollowness, one that's shaped exactly like her. It happens in late April, on a Tuesday evening in Margaret's apartment. They're having dinner, a simple pasta that Margaret has made, and that Robert has watched her prepare with his full attention, the way he watches everything she does now. The radio is playing softly. Everything is exactly as it usually is, except Robert gets a phone call. He doesn't recognize the number. He answers. It's his colleague James from work. Robert hasn't spoken to James in months. Margaret had suggested gently that James didn't really have Robert's best interests in mind. Robert, hi, James says. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time, but I'm in the area and I wanted to see if you wanted to grab a drink. I realize it's been a while. Robert looks at Margaret. He's learned to check her expression before committing to anything. But this time, something is different. This time, Margaret is shaking her head slowly. She's mouthing the words, "Tell him no." I'm actually in the middle of something, Robert tells James. Can I call you back? Of course, James says. But actually, I wanted to mention, I ran into your sister Lucia at the grocery store. She asked me to check on you. She's concerned. She says she hasn't heard from you in months. Robert feels Margaret stiffen next to him. I'm fine, he says quickly. You sure? Because Lucia seemed genuinely worried. She mentioned some woman named Margaret and she seemed to think. Robert hangs up. His hands are shaking. Margaret is staring at him. Her expression is unreadable. When she speaks, her voice is different. It's not warm. It's not kind. It's simply factual. I think it's time we talked about your boundaries, Margaret says. I think it's time you understood that the people who claim to care about you are actually threatened by your growth. She gets up from the table and walks to the window. She doesn't look at Robert, but he can see her reflection in the glass. You have to choose, she says quietly. You have to choose between me and them, and if you choose them, you need to understand what that means. It means you go back to being the man you were, the man who was invisible, the man who was alone. Robert wants to respond, but something has shifted. For the first time in months, he can see the edges of the performance. He can see Margaret as a character rather than as a person, and the sight of her, the way she's standing at the window, the calculated nature of her words, the absence of genuine emotion, crystallizes something he's been unable to see. Who are you? He asks quietly. Margaret turns around. For a moment, Robert sees genuine anger on her face. It's the first real emotion he's seen from her, and it's terrifying. I'm the only person who's ever loved you, she says, and then her expression smooths back into something controlled. I'm the woman who gave you a life, and if you're smart, you'll remember that. But the moment has passed. For the first time, Robert can see that this isn't love. This is consumption. Over the next few days, Robert finds himself in a strange state. He's still with Margaret. He's still going through the motions. But something fundamental has shifted. He's started to notice things he's been trained not to see. He notices that Margaret takes calls in the other room and speaks in a different accent. He notices that mail arrives addressed to a woman named Eleanor. He notices a collection of photographs in a drawer that show Margaret, or Eleanor, or whoever she is, with other men. In some of the photographs she looks younger. In some of the photographs she's wearing different clothing and hairstyles. But the expression is the same, a kind of performed warmth that now looks hollow to him. He wants to confront her, but he's terrified. He's terrified because he knows what will happen. She'll have an explanation. She'll have a reason. She'll have something that will pull him back into the lie, and he's not sure he has the strength to resist a second time. So instead he does something he hasn't done in 8 months. He calls his sister. Lucia answers on the second ring. She's crying before she even speaks. Robert, thank God. Are you safe? And in that moment, Robert understands that he's not safe. He's been unsafe for months and he's been too invested in the lie to recognize it. They talk for an hour. Robert tells his sister everything. Not because he's entirely ready to see it clearly, but because he finally has space to speak it out loud to someone who actually cares whether he lives or dies. Lucia tells him that she's been working with a private investigator. She tells him that Eleanor Reeves has done this before. She tells him the names of the other men. Robert listens to this information and feels something close to vertigo. The woman he's been sleeping next to, the woman he's given $40,000 to, the woman he's built his entire sense of self around. She's done this before multiple times. She's a professional deceiver. But here's the thing about being manipulated by someone who truly understands you. Even when you discover the manipulation, it's hard to believe that the person didn't, at some point, actually care about you. It's hard to believe that every word was a lie. It's hard to believe that the intimacy was entirely fabricated. Because if it was entirely fabricated, then you have to acknowledge that you're the kind of person who can be fooled that completely. You have to acknowledge that you're that vulnerable, that desperate, that easy to manipulate. It's easier to believe that there was some part of it that was real. It's easier to believe that she cared, even if she also stole from you. It's easier to believe that you weren't entirely foolish. What do I do? Robert asks his sister. You leave her, Lucia says simply. Tonight, you pack a bag and you come stay with us and we figure out the rest from there. Robert knows this is the right answer, but he also knows that he doesn't have the strength to do it alone. He asks Lucia to come get him. When Robert tells Margaret that he's leaving, she responds with a kind of fury he's never seen before. She's no longer performing. She's no longer Margaret. She's Eleanor, and Eleanor is furious that her construction is collapsing. You think you can do anything without me? She screams. You think you can function as a human being without me? You were nothing before I found you. You were a ghost. You were a failed man in a failed marriage. I made you real, and this is how you repay me? Robert, for the first time, doesn't believe her. He knows it's a lie because he's watched it work, and now he can see the mechanics of it. But Eleanor is banking on the fact that he'll still respond to it emotionally. And he does. He cries. He feels guilty. He wonders if she's right, if he really is nothing without her. But Lucia arrives before Eleanor can complete the psychological reconstruction, and Robert, with his sister's hand on his arm, manages to leave. It's the moment of choice that Robert has been approaching all along, and it comes down to the most basic decision possible, whether he trusts his sister or his doubts about himself. For the first time in 8 months, Robert chooses to trust someone besides Margaret. It's not a victory. He doesn't feel triumphant. He just feels exhausted and damaged and uncertain about whether he'll ever trust anyone again, but he chooses to leave. The aftermath is not as simple as Robert might have hoped. Leaving Eleanor is not the same as being free from her. It's like walking away from quicksand. You can get out, but the substance doesn't immediately release from your skin. It stays there, viscous and difficult, reminding you of where you've been. Robert moves in with Lucia and her family. For the first week, he barely speaks. He sits in their guest room and stares at the wall and tries to understand how he allowed this to happen. He reviews the 8 months with a kind of compulsive need to identify the exact moment when he should have known. If he can find that moment, maybe he can convince himself that he's not fundamentally broken. He can't find it. That's the devastating part. There was no moment. There were dozens of tiny moments, each one rational on its own, each one together creating a perfect architecture of deception. He's learning that most manipulation isn't a sudden change. It's an accumulation of small accommodations, each one seeming reasonable in isolation. The legal implications are significant. Robert hires a lawyer to understand what he can recover and what he's lost. The answer is almost nothing. The $40,000 is gone. The property existed briefly in Eleanor's name, but was transferred out and sold before Robert even understood what was happening. By the time his lawyer begins investigating, the money has been distributed through accounts and companies, and following it is nearly impossible. The physical and emotional facts are harder to quantify. Robert has lost the ability to trust his own judgment. He finds himself second-guessing every interaction, every piece of information. He doesn't believe anything without verification. He becomes, in some ways, the opposite of what he was before. Instead of being credulous and open, he becomes cynical and closed. He's trying to protect himself from being fooled again, but what he's actually doing is protecting himself from genuine connection. Eleanor, for her part, disappears. There's no note, no farewell, no attempt to contact him. She simply evaporates from New Jersey and from his life. The private investigator that Lucia hired reports that Eleanor Reeves has used at least 5 known identities across the country. She's done this before and she's doing it again. Robert is already becoming memory in her history. The marks are never real to the deceiver. They're only evidence of the deceiver's power. But something unexpected happens in the third week after Robert leaves. He receives a letter. It's from Margaret, or Eleanor, or whoever wrote it. The letter is handwritten and sealed with a wax stamp. The handwriting is elegant. The letter reads, "Robert, I know you think I'm a monster. I know you think everything was a lie. But some of it wasn't. Some of it was real. The only real thing I've ever experienced with another person. You made me want to be Margaret, not just perform her. And for a moment, I actually believed that I could be different. You made me believe I could be better. And that terrifies me more than anything. I'm leaving. You won't hear from me again. But I want you to know that you're not wrong about who you saw become real at the end. That was real. That was the only real version of myself I've ever been. And I'm sorry I couldn't stay in it. I'm sorry I'm too broken to be anyone but what I've always been. Take care of yourself, Robert. You're stronger than you know. M." Robert reads the letter and cries. He cries because he doesn't know if it's true or if it's the most sophisticated manipulation yet, a final attempt to make him love her, or at least pity her, or at least see her as human rather than as a predator. And the worst part is that he'll never know for certain. Some part of him wants to believe that the letter is real, that Eleanor did feel something, that their connection had some ground in actual emotion. Because if it didn't, then his vulnerability wasn't a human weakness, it was simply stupidity. And stupidity is harder to forgive than love. Lucia's husband, a practical man named Vincent, suggests that Robert contact the other men. If Eleanor, or whoever is really operating the con, has done this before, then the other victims might want to know. Robert does this. He reaches out to 3 men that the investigator identifies. 1 is in Pittsburgh. 1 is in Philadelphia. 1 is in Connecticut. They meet in person or on the phone, and Robert finds himself in the strange position of being both victim and witness. The man in Pittsburgh lost $35,000. He's filed a fraud report with the police, but nothing has come of it. He's bitter and angry, and has completely withdrawn from his family because of the shame. The man in Philadelphia lost $52,000. He attempted suicide 2 years after the affair ended. He survived, but he's still in therapy, still trying to understand how to trust. The man in Connecticut lost $28,000 and was actually engaged to Eleanor when she disappeared. He had to tell his fiancée that he was deceived, that his entire relationship had been based on a lie. He remained engaged to her, surprisingly, but there's a kind of fracture in his eyes when Robert talks to him. He's married now, but he carries the knowledge that he almost built a life with a woman who'd lied to him about everything. Each man tells a slightly different version of the same story. In each story, Eleanor or Margaret or whatever name she was using seemed like the answer to a specific loneliness. In each story, the woman was capable of identifying exactly what was missing in the man's life and filling it. In each story, the deception was systematic and slow enough that it seemed like love. And in each story, the aftermath was profound. The man in Pittsburgh hasn't had a relationship in 6 years. The man in Philadelphia is still learning how to function. The man in Connecticut is trying to convince himself that his marriage is real, but he's obsessively reviewing his wife's behavior for signs of deception. Robert realizes that this experience, this collective awareness that the same thing has been done to multiple people, has a strange impact. It suggests that he's not stupid specifically, he's not weak specifically. He's simply human in the way that humans are, capable of being fooled by someone who understands what we need and is willing to provide it without regard for cost. This doesn't make him feel better about the money. It doesn't make him feel better about the lost time or the damaged relationships, but it does shift something fundamental. He's no longer alone in his humiliation. He's part of a pattern, and patterns are easier to understand than random cruelty. By June, Robert is beginning to function again. He returns to work, and his manager is kind but professional. The promotion Eleanor convinced him he deserved is still his, though he's acutely aware that he may not have earned it yet. He works harder to prove it to himself. He reconnects with his children, and the process is painful. His son Michael is cold and angry. "Mom told us the truth about the divorce," Michael says, and Robert understands that Catherine has given her version of events, which likely makes Robert sound like he deserved what happened. His daughter Anna is kinder, but there's a distance there too. 8 months of abandonment isn't erased by showing up again. Lucia helps him rebuild his family relationships, slowly and carefully. She doesn't make excuses for him, but she helps his children understand that he was broken, and that being broken can make you vulnerable in ways that create consequences. In August, Robert receives a letter from his lawyer. The investigation into Eleanor's activities has expanded. There are more victims in other states. A pattern has emerged that goes back further than anyone thought. The FBI has begun investigating. Robert will be contacted if there are developments. There are no significant developments. Eleanor disappears into the criminal landscape, and Robert never knows whether she was caught or whether she simply moved to another state and started the pattern again with different men. But something happens to Robert in this period of legal uncertainty. He stops needing closure. He stops needing to know what happened to Eleanor or whether she faced consequences. He stops believing that understanding her will help him understand what happened to him. And in that release of the need for closure, he begins to heal. By September, a year after Eleanor's first phone call, Robert is not the same man he was. He's not the man he was before Eleanor either. He's a third version of himself, someone who understands that he's capable of being fooled but who chooses not to let that knowledge prevent him from genuine connection. He starts attending a group for fraud victims. There's a woman there named Helen who lost money to a different con. They talk occasionally after meetings. There's nothing romantic in it at first. It's just two people who understand the specific shame of having been fooled by someone they trusted. Months into the group, Helen asks Robert if he'd like to get coffee. Robert hesitates. He's terrified. But he also understands that living in fear is just another kind of trap. Yes, he tells her. I'd like that. When they go out for coffee, Robert is hyper-aware of every moment. He's looking for inconsistencies. He's listening for signs of performance. And he catches himself doing this. And he recognizes it as his own damage, not as anything Helen is doing. He tells Helen this. I'm going to be careful, he says. I'm going to look for signs that you're deceiving me. And I'm going to try not to let that ruin what might actually be good. Helen nods. I do the same thing, she says. I think everyone who's been deceived does. We become experts at detecting lies, but we forget how to recognize truth. And there, in that coffee shop, Robert understands something that Eleanor never understood. The difference between being loved and being understood is actually simple. Being loved means someone wants your well-being. Being understood by someone who doesn't love you is just being naked in front of someone with knives. Over the next year, Robert builds a genuine relationship with Helen. It's slower than what he had with Eleanor. It's less intoxicating, but it's real. Helen has seen his damage and doesn't require him to hide it. He's seen her damage and doesn't require her to heal. They're broken in complementary ways, and they don't pretend otherwise. By 1955, Robert has recovered about $8,000 of the $40,000 he lost. It's not much, but it's something. More importantly, he's recovered something that money can't buy, the recognition that he survived something designed to destroy him, and that survival is not the same as weakness. He never forgets Eleanor. He never entirely stops wondering about her, whether she's still conning men, whether she ever felt genuine affection for any of her victims, whether she's capable of actual transformation, or whether she's permanently trapped in the role she plays. But he stops letting these questions define him. He stops making her central to his understanding of what happened. And in that release, he finally becomes the man that Eleanor convinced him he could be. Not through her manipulation, but through his own will. He becomes someone who can hold joy and caution simultaneously. Someone who can trust without being naive. Someone who understands that vulnerability is not the same as weakness. The cruelest part of what Eleanor did to Robert is not that she stole his money. It's that she stole his trust, and she returned a version of self-awareness that Robert has to live with forever. The knowledge that he's the kind of person who can be fooled that thoroughly. But the most profound part of what Robert did in response is that he transformed that self-awareness into wisdom. He became someone who understood human vulnerability not as a flaw, but as a feature, something shared by all of us. Something that requires care and respect. And in that transformation, he becomes finally the person he always had the capacity to be. Eleanor just had to destroy almost everything first. What does it mean that this happened? What does it reveal about trust, about vulnerability, about the masks we all wear? Eleanor Reeves operated within a simple but devastating principle. Most people are not fooled by lies about external facts. They're fooled by truths about themselves that they've never articulated. When you can identify what someone desperately wants to believe about who they are, you can build a narrative around that belief that feels, to them, like recognition. Robert desperately wanted to believe that he was capable of genuine transformation. That's not a lie. Transformation is real. But Eleanor used that true possibility to extract something false: money, power, Control. She took something real about Robert and twisted it into something that served her. This is how sophisticated manipulation works. It doesn't rely on lies about external reality. It relies on truths about internal reality weaponized. And here's what makes Eleanor's particular deception so psychologically complex. She didn't just lie to Robert. She convinced Robert to lie to himself. Every time he ignored a red flag, he was making a choice, however difficult, to maintain the narrative that Eleanor was building. Every time he rationalized an inconsistency, he was doing her work for her. This is the uncomfortable truth that victims of sophisticated manipulation eventually confront. You can't be deceived without some participation in the deception. You can't be manipulated without some willingness to rationalize. The manipulator doesn't do all the work. They set up the conditions, and you complete the structure. This doesn't make Robert responsible for what Eleanor did. It does mean that Robert had to take responsibility for what he chose not to see, and that's a different kind of pain. Not the pain of being victimized, but the pain of understanding that you victimized yourself, even if the conditions were created by someone else. Eleanor's motivation in the end was not greed or malice in the simple sense. Eleanor was someone who had learned long ago that the only way to have power over another person is to become the person they need you to be, and then to extract everything before they realize you were never that person. This was the only form of love she understood. Love as transformation of the other person. Love as control. And here's the devastating part. Eleanor was probably the victim of the same dynamic. Somewhere in her past, someone taught her that love meant giving up yourself and trying to become what someone else needed. She learned to survive by learning to manipulate. She learned to feel powerful by learning to defraud. By the time she was operating on Robert, she was no longer capable of genuine vulnerability. She was only capable of performed vulnerability, performed so expertly that it looked like real. The journal she left behind, the confession in the final letter, these were probably performance too. Eleanor had lost the distinction between performing emotion and feeling it. She was trapped in the role the way Robert had been trapped before her. The difference was that Robert eventually got out. Eleanor never did. Eleanor couldn't, because Eleanor didn't have anyone like Lucia to pull her back toward reality. Eleanor only had the patterns. What Robert learned from this experience is something most of us spend our entire lives avoiding. The recognition that we're all capable of being fooled, and we're all capable of fooling others. Robert understood that within him, under different circumstances, there could be an Eleanor, and Eleanor, under different circumstances, could have been something else. This is what makes deception so philosophically troubling. It reveals that the boundary between deceiver and deceived, between manipulator and victim, is not as clear as we'd like it to be. It reveals that we're all operating with some level of self-deception. We're all performing some version of ourselves that isn't entirely real. The question isn't whether you'll be fooled. The question is whether, when you discover the fool you've been, you can transform that discovery into wisdom. Whether you can become someone who understands vulnerability in yourself and others. Whether you can use the pain as education, rather than just as scar tissue. Robert did this. Not perfectly, not without carrying permanent damage, but he did it. He became someone who could recognize vulnerability in others without exploiting it. He became someone who could trust without being naive. He became someone who understood that the people who hurt us most are usually people who are broken in similar ways to us. They just learned different survival strategies. Years later, Robert read a psychology article about something called identity fragmentation, and he understood finally what had been happening with Eleanor. She wasn't one person pretending to be someone else. She was genuinely fragmented. She really was multiple people inside one body, and she didn't have a core sense of self that could be honest, because there was no single self, to be honest. The question of whether she was lying became almost meaningless. She was just being the person that context required her to be. This understanding didn't make Robert forgive her, but it did allow him to release her. He stopped needing her to be a villain. He let her be what she actually was. A person so damaged by her own experiences that she could only relate to others through the architecture of deception, and in releasing her, he released himself. But here's the final question, the one that we usually leave unanswered. Could this happen to you? The answer is yes. Not because you're weak, not because you're stupid, but because you're human, and human beings are designed with the capacity for hope. Hope is what allows us to stay in situations that hurt us. Hope is what allows us to believe that things can be different. Hope is what makes us vulnerable to someone who understands how to use our own capacity for transformation against us. The only people who are completely protected from this kind of deception are people who have given up on hope, people who don't believe that they can change or that anyone can love them, or that genuine connection is possible. People who are already, in a sense, dead. So the question isn't really whether you'll be deceived. The question is whether you're willing to be vulnerable enough to hope that things can be better, whether you're willing to trust enough to connect, whether you're willing to take the risk that someone you believe in might disappoint you. If the answer is yes, then you're capable of being deceived the way Robert was deceived. You're capable of meeting someone who understands exactly what you need and using that need to extract everything from you. You're capable of being fooled, completely and utterly fooled, but you're also capable of surviving it. You're capable of understanding what happened without letting it destroy your capacity to connect. You're capable of becoming someone who is both open and aware, both trusting and careful, both vulnerable and strong. Robert Castellano, a man who lost more than money to Eleanor Reeves, understood this, and in that understanding he became the person he was supposed to be, not the person Eleanor created, but the person he created from the ashes of her deception. The question finally is not whether you'll be fooled. The question is what you'll do when you recognize the fool you've been. Will you use it to close yourself off forever? Or will you use it to understand something true about what it means to be human? The answer to that question is not in Eleanor's hands. It's in yours. If you've experienced deception like this, either as the one deceived or as someone watching from the outside, we're interested in the psychological patterns. What did you miss? What did you see? What does it reveal about how trust works? Share your story at velvettraps@gmail.com. Anonymous submissions welcome. Your perspective helps us understand ourselves. Velvet Traps exist to explore the psychology of deception, not to celebrate it. If you have a story about trust broken, identity hidden, or manipulation endured, write to velvettraps@gmail.com. These stories help us understand ourselves and each other. Every submission is read. Your experience matters.